September 1944. High above Frankfurt, American bombers cruise at altitude over the industrial core of Nazi Germany. When their bomb bay doors open, they do not release the usual loads of high explosives. No blast bombs plunge toward factories. No incendiary clusters streak down toward rail yards. Instead, something unexpected drifts out into the darkness. Thousands of small parcels begin to fall, floating slowly through the night air toward streets, rooftops, and the shattered courtyards of a city already battered by years of air raids. Each parcel is about the size of a human hand, wrapped simply, with a red card attached. Printed on that card, across 11 different languages, are clear instructions. Simple diagrams show how to use the object inside. Words are almost unnecessary. The pictures are enough for any factory worker, any laborer, any prisoner to understand, regardless of where they come from. Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, French, Dutch, Czech, and 5 other languages of conquered nations appear together. Languages spoken by millions of forced laborers now working inside German factories. Inside each package lies a small transparent celluloid container filled with a highly flammable gel. This is not a weapon meant for soldiers on the front lines. It is designed for civilians in captivity. Small enough to slip into a pocket, easy to hide in a lunch tin, simple to tuck beneath coal piles, rags, or machinery in any one of the countless factories, warehouses, and depots that sustain the German war effort. That September night, roughly 200,000 of these fire devices fell over Frankfurt and nearby Mainz. Each could burn at temperatures reaching 2,000 degrees Celsius for about 4 minutes. Each was fitted with a delayed ignition fuse, allowing whoever placed the time to walk away and establish an alibi before the fire began. The heat was enough to ignite nearly anything: wooden crates, textile stockpiles, or the oils and lubricants essential to industrial machines. By morning, German authorities were in panic. Police units launched urgent searches across the city. SS officers stormed the dormitories of Dutch forced laborers housed in the Crystal Palace on Gallerstrasse. Factory managers reported unusually large numbers of foreign workers absent from their shifts. Security teams flooded industrial sites, combing living quarters, examining workspaces, and interrogating anyone who appeared even slightly suspicious. German authorities soon announced that between 20,000 and 25,000 of the devices had already been recovered since the drops. But what truly alarmed security officials was not what they had collected. It was what remained unaccounted for. They feared that tens of thousands more had already been picked up by foreign laborers or, as internal reports described them, other unreliable elements, hidden away and waiting for the right moment to be used. The difference between the number recovered and the number released represented a terrifying unknown. It was a gap filled with possibility, uncertainty, and fear. British planners had designed this operation with ruthless calculation. They understood the arithmetic of disorder. They named it Operation Braddock. Their estimates were stark. If even 1% of the incendiary devices proved effective, it would result in roughly 30,000 fires across Germany, 30,000 blazes that would resemble industrial accidents, 30,000 incidents that would overwhelm fire brigades, trigger investigations, demand repairs, and disrupt production schedules. Each fire, on its own, might seem manageable. Together, they would drain the system. Yet the true brilliance of Operation Braddock was not the fires themselves. Its real power lay in something far more damaging to the Nazi war effort. Britain had found a way to turn an existing presence inside the Reich into a weapon, an enemy already there. Millions of foreign workers labored inside Germany, spread across factories, railway yards, power plants, and farms. They were everywhere, watching, enduring, waiting, and now potentially armed. The labor force that kept Germany's war economy alive was suddenly reimagined. In the frightened minds of factory supervisors and Gestapo officials alike, exhausted workers were no longer just laborers. They were possible saboteurs. Overnight, the workforce upon which Germany depended for survival had become a source of existential dread. To understand how Britain reached the point of arming foreign workers inside Nazi Germany, one must first grasp the sheer scale of the forced labor system the Reich had constructed. By the summer of 1944, Germany had created one of the largest systems of coerced labor in human history. More than 20 million men, women, and children from across occupied Europe had been forced to work for the German war effort at some stage during the conflict. The Nazi regime had systematically stripped conquered nations of their people, just as it stripped them of raw materials and wealth, plundering entire populations to feed its war machine. At its height in August 1944, an estimated 7.6 million foreign civilians and prisoners of war were employed inside the German Reich at any one time. Of this total, around 2.8 million came from the Soviet Union, many seized during violent roundups that tore through Ukrainian and Belarusian villages. Another 1.7 million were taken from Poland, driven into labor by decrees that made virtually every able-bodied Pole liable for deportation. About 1.3 million came from France. The rest were drawn from Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy after its surrender, and nearly every other country under German occupation. Together, these workers made up roughly 20% of Germany's entire workforce. 1 out of every 5 laborers in the Reich was a foreigner, employed under coercion of varying degrees. In some factories, the imbalance was even more extreme, with foreign workers accounting for 80 or even 90% of the staff. Without them, German arms production would have ground to a halt. Without them, farms would have failed to feed the civilian population. Without them, the rail network could not have moved soldiers and supplies to front. The wartime economy of the Third Reich rested squarely on the labor of enslaved outsiders. These forced workers lived under relentless supervision, enforced by a harsh system of control. The Gestapo, the SS, the Wehrmacht local police units, factory guards known as workshuts, and even ordinary German citizens, encouraged and informed on suspicious behavior, all monitored them closely. Laborers from Poland and the Soviet Union were required to wear identifying badges at all times. They were housed in guarded camps, allowed to leave only for work, and faced execution for infractions as small as forming romantic relationships with German civilians. Attempted escape was punishable by death. Sabotage meant death. Almost any act of resistance carried the same sentence. Yet even the most ruthless surveillance had its limits. 7 million people could not be observed every minute of every day. As Germany descended into chaos under relentless Allied bombing, cities burning night after night, daily routines shattered, the machinery of repression began to crack. The Gestapo was overstretched. Local police forces were critically understaffed. Control remained brutal, but it was no longer absolute. Factory supervisors were preoccupied with meeting production targets, not maintaining security. The Special Operations Executive had been analyzing this vulnerability since 1943. Formed by Winston Churchill in July 1940 with a mission to set Europe ablaze, the SOE spent years perfecting sabotage techniques that favored deception over raw destruction. They designed coal-shaped explosives indistinguishable from real fuel, capable of being slipped into coal heaps and detonating once fed into locomotive boilers. They produced incendiary devices disguised as Chianti bottles, complete with real wine in the neck to make the illusion convincing. They even developed tire-destroying charges hidden inside fake animal droppings, scattered along roads frequently used by German supply convoys. Lord Selborne, who became Minister of Economic Warfare in February 1942 and assumed political oversight of the SOE, recognized the enormous potential represented by the millions of foreign laborers inside Germany. These people were not loyal citizens of the Reich. Many had been dragged from their homes during violent raids. Many had seen relatives killed or sent to concentration camps. Many had watched their villages burned and their communities erased. Resentment and rage were widespread, needing only a means to be released. The central problem was how to deliver that means. SOE operatives could be parachuted into occupied territories like France or Norway, where established resistance networks could shelter them and support their missions. Germany, however, was another matter entirely. Inside the Reich, there were no resistance movements comparable to those elsewhere in Europe. Security was tighter, indoctrination deeper, punishment harsher, and the chances of infiltrating agents surviving, let alone succeeding, were extremely slim. But a different idea emerged. What if the agents were already there? What if millions of potential saboteurs were already embedded inside every vital factory, rail yard, and power station in Germany, lacking only the tools to act. What if the very labor force sustaining German industry could be turned into a force of destruction? It was this realization that led the SOE, in 1943, to begin developing what would later be known as Operation Braddock. The idea went through multiple revisions as planners argued over the most effective method. The earliest version, known as WWII, proposed dropping 50,000 attack kits that would include not only incendiary devices, but also small firearms. The aim was to give foreign workers the means to kill individual Germans, seize their weapons, and gradually arm a broader resistance movement. The firearm chosen for this plan was the FP-45 Liberator pistol, one of the strangest weapons produced during the war. Built by General Motors Guide Lamp Division in Anderson, Indiana, the Liberator was a deliberately crude, single-shot pistol designed for speed and extreme low cost rather than performance. The entire gun consisted of just 23 stamped and machined steel parts. It could fire only 1.45 caliber round before needing to be reloaded, a slow process that required a wooden dowel to push out the spent casing. Despite its simplicity, production was astonishingly fast. During the summer of 1942, just 300 American workers manufactured 1 million Liberator pistols in only 11 weeks. Each pistol cost the U.S. government about $2.10 to produce, roughly equivalent to $40 today. Its effective range is extremely limited, around 4 yards, due to its smooth, unrifled barrel. But the weapon was never intended for conventional combat. It was meant for close-range killing. A resistance member could approach an unsuspecting German soldier, fire at point-blank distance, take the soldier's superior weapon, and vanish. Ultimately, however, the Braddock concept was shelved. Senior military leaders, including General Dwight D. Eisenhower, questioned whether mass weapon drops were practical or wise. There were deep concerns about inevitable German reprisals against civilians and prisoners of war. The Nazi regime had repeatedly shown that it responded to partisan attacks with mass executions, hostage killings, and the destruction of entire towns. As a result, the Liberator pistols were diverted elsewhere, some supplied to the French resistance, others sent to insurgent forces in Asia and the Pacific. Braddock II marked a clear shift in strategy. Firearms were removed from the plan entirely. Instead, the operation would rely solely on incendiary devices, focusing on sabotage rather than armed confrontation. They were compact, easy to hide, and required no special training to operate. Anyone could set a fire. Anyone could conceal a small parcel. Anyone could follow simple picture-based instructions, showing how to activate a delayed fuse. Sabotage no longer demanded expertise or experience. The threshold for participation was reduced almost to nothing. Development took place across the SOE's network of research facilities scattered throughout the English countryside, concealed behind harmless-sounding names such as the Inter-Services Research Bureau. Station 12, located at Aston House near Stevenage, became the main center for producing sabotage explosives and specialized weapons. Station 15, housed in a thatched barn near Boreham Wood, focused on concealment and disguise, recruiting artists, prop designers, and even stage magicians to create devices capable of surviving close inspection. Station 9, at Fried Estate near Welwyn Garden City, concentrated on weapons research and development. The people working at these sites came from astonishingly varied backgrounds. Chemists worked side by side with theatrical prop makers. Engineers collaborated with craftspeople drawn from the film industry. Taxidermists assisted in creating disguised explosives that appeared completely ordinary. Skilled forgers produced documents designed to withstand examination by German security forces. Their shared goal was clear: to build devices that could escape casual notice, be hidden in plain sight, and be used by anyone, regardless of education or technical skill. By November 1943, the target of 3 million incendiary devices had been reached. Yet, manufacturing them was only part of the problem. Deciding when and how to deploy them sparked months of debate, as military and political leaders carefully weighed potential gains against serious risks. The incendiary device at the core of Braddock II was deceptively simple. It consisted of a small transparent container made from celluloid, a highly flammable material once commonly used in early photographic film. Inside was combustible gel. Early prototypes relied on a petrol-based mixture, but testing revealed serious flaws. The compound was unstable, had a limited shelf life, and would complicate long-term storage and deployment. Estimates suggested that as many as 20 to 30% of these petrol-based devices would fail to function. The formula was improved by switching to a white spirit base gel, which proved far more stable and reliable, dramatically lowering the expected failure rate. The ignition system was adapted from the time pencil, fuses the SOE already employed in other sabotage missions. To activate it, the user crushed a built-in firing pin, triggering a chemical process. A small glass capsule filled with acid shattered, and the acid slowly corroded a thin copper wire. The thickness of that wire determined the length of the delay. Once the wire finally dissolved, it released a spring-loaded striker, which ignited the incendiary compound. Multiple versions of the device were produced, each offering different delay intervals to match operational requirements. Some ignited after just 15 or 30 minutes, ideal for situations where a saboteur needed to leave a location quickly. Others were set for 3 hours, allowing a worker to finish a shift and depart normally. Longer delays, 8 hours or even as much as 34 hours, made it possible to plant a device during a morning shift and be far away when the fire erupted the next day. By then, dozens of other workers might have passed through the area, making it virtually impossible to identify the person responsible. When ignition occurred, the device burned at roughly 2,000 degrees Celsius for about 4 minutes, around 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit, far hotter than an ordinary fire. The heat was sufficient to ignite almost any combustible material nearby. It could set warehouses and supplies ablaze, ignite factories filled with volatile chemicals, torch railway cars loaded with fuel or ammunition, and devastate depots storing the materials that sustained Germany's war industry. The true brilliance of Firepack lay not simply in its destructive power, but in its psychological design. Every aspect was carefully engineered to exploit the realities of forced labor inside Nazi Germany. Its compact size made it easy to hide. The delayed fuse allowed the user to escape suspicion. The illustrated instructions overcame language barriers. The card, printed in 11 languages, sent a clear message. The Allies knew exactly who was working inside German factories, and were addressing them directly. To grasp its impact, consider the situation of a Polish or Soviet laborer working inside a German munitions plant in 1944. You work 12-hour shifts under the watch of armed guards. You are underfed, surviving on rations far inferior to those given to your German overseers. Your body is worn down by labor, so punishment will be considered extreme even for well-nourished workers. Fear is constant. Any mistake, real or imagined, can lead to a beating, imprisonment, or death. You've seen friends and co-workers killed for trivial offenses. You know the Allied armies are advancing and that Germany is losing the war, yet freedom feels impossibly far away. Each day brings fresh suffering, with no clear end. Then imagine that one night, something falls from the sky, a small package meant for you, instructions written in your own language, a device that requires no training, no technical knowledge, no experience with weapons, something small enough to hide in your clothing, something that could be placed during a normal work shift without drawing attention, something that allows you to strike back at those who stole your freedom, murdered your family, and worked you to the edge of death. Something that, for once, makes the oppressors afraid. The time delay fuse was central to the psychology of the operation. A fire that erupted immediately after placement would clearly be sabotage, and the person responsible would likely be identified and executed within hours. But a fire that began 8 or even 34 hours later, after dozens of workers had passed through the area, after shifts had changed multiple times, after the person who planted had a solid alibi, would appear accidental. It would look like a mechanical spark, careless handling of flammable materials, or one of the countless industrial mishaps common in factories strained by wartime demands. Planning for Braddock II sparked months of intense debate at the highest levels of British military and political leadership. The SOE argued strongly for large-scale deployment before the Allied landings in Normandy. They believed that crippling German industry in advance would directly support the invasion by reducing the enemy's ability to manufacture weapons, move reinforcements, and sustain logistics. They proposed focusing on northwestern Germany, a region with a dense concentration of foreign laborers and already subjected to continuous attacks by RAF Bomber Command. Where sabotage could amplify the damage already being inflicted from the air, the ongoing bombing campaign offered ideal cover for sabotage. In the aftermath of an air raid, fires were expected as a matter of course. Any additional blazes would simply merge into confusion and destruction. Yet the RAF was far from enthusiastic. To disperse just 500,000 incendiary packages would require around 50 Avro Lancaster heavy bombers. Air Force leaders argued that those aircraft would be far more effective dropping conventional incendiary bombs, munitions guaranteed to ignite, rather than scattering devices that might never be used by foreign workers who might not be willing to risk their lives. Timing became another deeply divisive issue. There were serious fears of German retaliation. The Nazi regime had repeatedly demonstrated that it answered resistance with collective punishment, mass executions of hostages, the razing of entire villages, and brutal reprisals against civilians. After the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in Czechoslovakia in 1942, the Germans had annihilated the villages of Lidice and Lizaki, murdering nearly all their inhabitants. There was a real danger that arming foreign workers would simply lead to the deaths of thousands of innocent people. The moral calculation was painful and unresolved for months. Ultimately, in May 1944, the Joint Intelligence Committee approved Operation Braddock II, to be launched as soon as possible after D-Day. The Allied invasion would stretch German security forces to the breaking point as they concentrated on the military threat from the West. The presence of Allied armies in France would also give foreign laborers hope that liberation was near. From a psychological standpoint, the moment was judged ideal. Although the danger of reprisals remained, British planners concluded that the potential damage to German war production justified the risk. The packages themselves were designed for absolute simplicity and immediate understanding. Each fire pack was attached to a red card, measuring roughly 6 by 4 inches. Printed on the card were basic instructions for use, translated into 11 different languages representing the main nationalities among Germany's forced labor force. These included French, Dutch, Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, Czech, Italian, Serbian, Croatian, and others. The choice of languages was guided by intelligence assessments of the ethnic makeup of foreign workers across different regions of the Reich. The instructions relied on clear, visual diagrams that could be understood even by people who could not read or who spoke none of the listed languages. The first image showed hands crushing the device at a clearly marked spot. The second showed the device being placed in a hidden location. The third showed a figure walking away. The fourth showed flames bursting out. Crush here. Wait. Fire begins. The message was unmistakable and required no explanation. SOE planners assumed that most of the packages would never be used. Many would be lost, destroyed, or seized by German authorities. But sheer numbers were the key. With millions of devices scattered across the Reich, thousands were certain to reach the people they were intended for. If 3 million fire packs were distributed and only 1% were successfully employed, the outcome would still be around 30,000 fires across Germany. Each blaze would drain German resources, fire brigades, investigators, repair crews. Each would deepen an atmosphere of anxiety and uncertainty that was already undermining morale. Each would force the authorities to divert attention and manpower away from the front lines and toward internal security. The cumulative effect mattered more than any single act of sabotage. The operation was paired with a carefully planned propaganda campaign, designed both to prepare foreign workers for what was happening and to magnify the psychological shock felt by German officials. On the day of the first drop, the radio station of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force broadcast a direct appeal to foreign force laborers inside Germany. The timing was deliberate. As the packages drifted down from the sky, the voices on the radio spoke to those below, forging a powerful mental link between the message and the weapons now in their hands. The hour of action has arrived. The broadcast declared, repeating the message in multiple languages. It explained that in certain areas of Germany, organized groups of foreign workers were already being supplied with materials for active resistance. Anyone who discovered a parcel was instructed to read the enclosed directions and hide the device safely until they had determined the best moment to use it. The emphasis was on caution and preparation, not immediate action, reducing the risk of rash behavior that could lead to arrest or execution. The message was carefully designed to suggest that the fire packs were only one part of a much larger, coordinated resistance movement operating inside the Reich itself. Whether such resistance networks truly existed was almost beside the point. Their actual presence mattered far less than their impact on the German imagination. What mattered was that security forces believed they were real. What mattered was that every unexplained fire would now be treated as deliberate sabotage. What mattered was that every foreign worker would suddenly be regarded with suspicion and fear. On September 25, 1944, U.S. Army Air Forces bombers released the first wave of 200,000 fire packs over the Frankfurt and Mainz region. The packages floated down through the darkness, settling onto streets and rooftops, into courtyards and empty lots, among the ruins of bombed-out buildings, and into gardens of houses spread across a broad area of one of Germany's most vital industrial zones. Frankfurt was a center of manufacturing, finance, and transportation, precisely the kind of city where large numbers of foreign laborers were concentrated. The German reaction was swift and telling. SS units immediately moved to search districts known to house foreign workers. The raid on the Dutch laborers' dormitory at the Crystal Palace made clear how seriously the authorities viewed the threat. Police and security forces fanned out across the city, launching searches, inspections, and interrogations as they tried to regain control and face an enemy they could not see. German authorities began an urgent effort to retrieve as many of the dropped packages as possible before they could reach what they defined as hostile hands. This massive search effort disrupted everyday routines and pulled manpower and attention away from other security responsibilities. Within a few days, officials publicly claimed that between 20,000 and 25,000 devices had been recovered. The announcement was meant to calm public fears, but it had the opposite effect. If as many as 25,000 items had already been collected, how many remained undiscovered? How many were now hidden in workers' barracks, stashed in factory storerooms, slipped into pockets, or buried beneath coal heaps and rags, waiting to be used at the right moment? The difference between the number released and the number recovered represented a frightening uncertainty. The clearest evidence of German unease emerged inside the factories. Reports indicated that an unusually large number of foreign laborers failed to appear for work in the days following the drop. The reasons were unclear. Some may have stayed away to search for packages. Others may have feared harsh reprisals. Some may already have been preparing acts of sabotage, while others were simply unable to reach their jobs due to widespread disruption. Regardless of the cause, the result was identical. Production slowed, schedules collapsed, and output fell. German security services now faced an unsolvable problem. Around 7 million foreign workers were indispensable to the German war economy. Locking them inside their camps would cripple the factories producing weapons, aircraft, vehicles, and supplies. Restricting their movement within industrial sites was equally impossible. Subjecting every worker to searches upon entering or leaving facilities would create delays so severe that they would damage the war effort more than sabotage itself. Yet at the same time, any one of those 7 million laborers might be carrying a small incendiary device capable of destroying a warehouse, a supply depot, or a rail car loaded with critical materials, to collapse this entire system. The danger was too widespread, involving too many individuals across too many locations, to be contained by traditional security methods. You could not imprison 7 million people. You could not kill the entire foreign workforce as a preventive measure, and without them, the economy would cease to function. Every unexplained fire now demanded an investigation. Was it deliberate or accidental? Every missing foreign worker raised alarms. Were they sick, hiding, or preparing something? Every production failure, mechanical malfunction, or missed deadline could be intentional sabotage rather than an ordinary industrial setback. This growing paranoia was corrosive, steadily eroding efficiency and morale. As Germany's military position worsened, these scattered drops continued into 1945. Deepening the sense of crisis, in February, additional packages were released over multiple regions of Germany. The last confirmed drop took place above the town of FDH on April 5, 1945, only weeks before Germany formally surrendered. After this point, Further deployments were canceled, as Allied planners judged that the operation had achieved its intended effect. The decision to bring it to an end rested on two main considerations. First, Germany's defeat was now clearly unavoidable. Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin from the east, while American and British armies were advancing across the Rhine from the west. Resources allocated to Operation Braddock could now be redirected to more urgent priorities or conserved for post-war responsibilities. Second, Allied leaders feared that German security services, acting out of desperation in the war's final days, might carry out large-scale reprisals against prisoners of war and forced laborers. With liberation close at hand, it appeared reckless to provoke such retaliation when freedom was likely only days or weeks away. The remaining fire packs were destroyed on May 3, 1945, just shortly before Victory in Europe Day. One SOE officer recorded their disposal with grim humor, noting that they would make an appropriate bonfire for VE Day, a remark that reflected both fatigue and relief at the war's conclusion. Intelligence reports from the final months of the conflict confirmed that German police units spent significant effort surveilling foreign laborers and pursuing suspected arsonists responsible for a series of suspicious fires across various regions of Germany during the spring of 1945. The fear that 4 to 5 million small but powerful time-delay incendiary devices might be concealed throughout the Reich weighed heavily on German authorities. Assets that should have been dedicated to defending Germany militarily were instead drained by the search for hidden fire packs and the investigation of every unexplained fire. Measuring the ultimate effectiveness of Operation Braddock with precision is extremely difficult. This is not a matter of avoiding judgment, but an acknowledgement of historical reality. In a Germany that was simultaneously under relentless Allied bombing, invaded by ground forces from both east and west, and collapsing from within, it was virtually impossible to distinguish fires caused by incendiary devices from those resulting from air attacks, ground combat, failing infrastructure, or simple accident. There was no controlled trial, no scientific method for isolating the effects of Operation Braddock from the many other forces undermining German industrial production. What can be assessed is the German reaction itself. The redirection of security forces away from other duties, the loss of output when workers fail to report for shifts, the added surveillance burden placed on already strained police and Gestapo units, and the mounting psychological strain on factory supervisors, military leaders, and ordinary citizens who now had reason to fear the millions of foreign laborers living among them. Investigations multiplied. Searches became routine. Interrogations increased. Countless man-hours were consumed by suspicion and anxiety. The SOE had anticipated this outcome. Their planners believed that even limited success would justify the operation. Their estimate that a 1% effectiveness rate could result in 30,000 fires was intentionally cautious. While the true impact cannot be quantified with precision, it was almost certainly substantial. Germany could not afford to dismiss a danger that might emerge at any location at any moment, carried by any one of millions of potential saboteurs. If you are finding this subject compelling, a quick subscription helps more than you might realize. Now, it is important to understand why Operation Braddock represents more than a simple act of sabotage. Braddock demonstrated a core principle of asymmetric warfare, one that military theorists would spend decades studying after the war. When confronting irregular or unconventional threats, the cost of defense nearly always outweighs the cost of attack. The attacker decides when, where, and how to strike. The defender, by contrast, must protect everything everywhere at all times. This imbalance inherently favors the attacker, even when individual strikes fail. Britain committed relatively limited resources to manufacture and disperse roughly 3 million fire packs. Production was simple. Delivery relied on bomber fleets already in operation. Coordination with propaganda efforts required planning, but not enormous expense. Germany, meanwhile, was compelled to commit far greater resources in response, conducting security briefings across its entire military and industrial system, and sustaining a costly, continuous state of alert. Thousands of industrial sites were subjected to new inspection procedures. Workers were pulled away from productive tasks to search labor camps and closely observe foreign employees. Every suspicious fire triggered a formal investigation. Guards and informers were assigned to watch constantly for any hint of sabotage. The imbalance between British effort and German reaction was striking. With a comparatively small investment of materials and manpower, Britain generated effects that would have required enormous conventional military resources if attempted through direct attack. Each hour a German security official spent hunting for concealed incendiary devices was an hour lost to other responsibilities. Every fire treated as possible sabotage drained resources that might otherwise have supported combat operations. Operation Braddock was only one element of a broader SOE strategy aimed at turning fear itself into a weapon rather than relying solely on physical destruction. The so-called explosive rat scheme, although intercepted before any devices were actually used, still achieved its psychological purpose. German security forces spent months searching coal stocks throughout occupied Europe. The captured rats were displayed at German military facilities as proof of British deception, but this effort backfired by spreading precisely the anxiety SOE intended to create. Similarly, explosive coal manufactured to resemble local fuel types forced railway crews to inspect supplies before loading locomotive tenders, slowing transport operations across the entire rail network. In another operation, SOE agent Ben Calvin arranged for shipments of itching powder to be distributed and mixed into German uniforms. In one recorded incident, a German U-boat was compelled to return to port prematurely when its crew, suffering intense irritation from contaminated clothing, believed they had developed a mysterious skin disease. From a strategic standpoint, the loss of a single submarine patrol had little direct military importance. Psychologically, however, the message was powerful. It showed that the enemy could reach anywhere in any form, even through something as personal as a soldier's underwear. The implication was clear. No part of German life was beyond interference. The same principle was demonstrated by Michael Trotobus and his network of farmers who posed as Gestapo officials, gained access to the locomotive works, and succeeded in destroying the facility entirely. The Royal Air Force had attempted to destroy the same facility from the air on 4 separate occasions, and had failed each time, losing both planes and crews without achieving their objective. Yet a handful of agents, armed with explosives and boldness, succeeded where hundreds of bombers had not. Trotobus was later killed in a firefight with German forces, but his operation highlighted the remarkable impact of unconventional warfare. The Americans, through the Office of Strategic Services, pursued similar irregular programs. American explosive coal came with sophisticated camouflage kits, allowing field operatives to paint devices, so they matched local coal types perfectly. The OSS recognized the potential of such initiatives. Nevertheless, the United States, with its vast industrial resources, generally favored direct action over psychological operations when forced to choose between the two. The U.S. could afford to produce enough bombers to pound German industry through sheer volume. Britain, constrained by resources and engaged in a struggle for survival since 1940, had a more acute understanding. Perception could outweigh reality. A Germany convinced that its foreign laborers might be saboteurs was a Germany compelled to divert personnel from combat to constant surveillance. A Germany that feared incendiary devices hidden in every factory was a Germany whose productivity suffered under paranoia and overcaution. Centuries of experience and empire had taught the British the power of psychological manipulation in ways their American allies were still learning. The lessons of Operation Braddock would shape military thought for decades, exploiting an enemy's internal vulnerabilities, creating threats that provoke disproportionate defensive measures, and weaponizing fear instead of explosives became central concepts in Cold War strategy. The British SOE's experience directly influenced the development of special operations forces in NATO and militaries around the world. The operation also highlighted the potential of what would later be called fourth-generation warfare, conflict not fought mainly between uniformed armies on defined battlefields, but involving civilian populations, irregular forces, and psychological strategies that blur the line between combatants and non-combatants. The foreign laborers in German factories were not soldiers, yet they could be turned into a weapon far more effective than any conventional army. In modern terms, the principle that small actions can provoke massive defensive responses has found parallels in fields such as cybersecurity and counterterrorism. Defending against an unknown or dispersed threat almost always costs more than creating it. Operation Braddock illustrated this concept with striking clarity. For decades after the war, documents relating to Braddock remained classified. The full scope of the operation only emerged as British government archives gradually became accessible to historians in the late 20th century. Researchers discovered the meticulous planning of the SOE, debates over timing, the selection of targets, coordination of propaganda with the drops, and intelligence assessments of German reactions. The archival record demonstrates that what might appear at first as a desperate gamble was, in fact, a carefully calculated campaign. Physical remnants of the operation are extremely rare, unlike conventional weapons or equipment, which often survive in museums or private collections. The fire packs were designed to be expended in use. Those recovered by German authorities were presumably destroyed as hazardous materials. Those that were not found either deteriorated over time or were eventually deployed as intended. The very effectiveness of the design ensured that few physical examples survived. What remains of the documents, planning memoranda, production records, intelligence reports tracking German responses, and the propaganda broadcasts. These papers tell the true story of the operation. Success achieved not only through the fires it may or may not have started, but through the fear instilled in the enemy and the resources it compelled them to divert. Operation Braddock was just one part of a broader SOE campaign that played a significant role in the Allied victory. From its creation in July 1940 until its disbandment in January 1946, the organization deployed agents across nearly every occupied European country and many territories in Asia. Its missions range from the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in Czechoslovakia to the sabotage of the heavy water plant at Vemork in Norway, which delayed the German atomic bomb program, and the coordination of the French resistance, including acts of sabotage that slowed German reinforcements after D-Day. What set Braddock apart was its scale and concept. Rather than focusing on specific targets or individuals, it aimed to transform an entire population into potential instruments of warfare. Instead of destroying infrastructure directly, it sought to make the Germans undermine their own efficiency through fear and overreaction. It was psychological warfare in its purest form. Minimal material resources deployed to create maximum mental and operational disruption. The fire packs dropped over Frankfurt in September 1944 were not remarkable weapons by themselves. They consist of a small celluloid container, some flammable gel, and a time delay fuse, a technology the SOE had been using for years. By early 20th century standards, it was crude, unsophisticated, and required neither advanced engineering nor rare materials. What made these devices extraordinary was the strategy behind them. The planners recognized that Germany's greatest weakness was not its factories, railways, or military installations, but the millions of resentful, desperate individuals it had forced into labor. They understood that these workers, armed with minimal tools and the knowledge that they were not acting alone, could become a powerful force multiplier for Allied operations. They realized that fear itself could be a weapon more devastating than any conventional bomb. The forced labors of Nazi Germany had been dehumanized, exploited, and terrorized by a system that treated them as expendable resources, worked to death and replaced with new captives. Operation Braddock exploited this human vulnerability with remarkable insight, turning oppression into an instrument of strategic advantage. Operation Braddock gave the laborers something the Reich had long sought to erase: agency, the chance to push back against their oppressors. Even those who never discovered Firepack, never planted a device, never ignited a flame, still gained a sense of resistance simply from knowing such tools existed. The knowledge that the Allies were thinking of them, that liberation might be near, offered a spark of hope against despair. Ultimately, the real fire sparked by Operation Braddock was not in German warehouses or rail depots. It burned in the minds of German security officials, who were suddenly forced to question every worker, every shadow, and every unexplained incident. And it blazed in the hearts of millions of foreign laborers who, witnessing packages falling from the night sky, understood that they had not been forgotten, that someone somewhere was fighting on their behalf, and that the darkness of their captivity might soon end. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon is not the one that physically destroys your enemy. It is the one that drives them to destroy themselves, through fear what they cannot see, cannot find, and cannot control.